The cellar is a sealed vessel of sensory deprivation, defined not by what is there, but by what is missing. There is no light, save for the gray smudge of a ventilation grate choked with coal dust. There is no heat, only the damp subterranean chill that radiates from the limestone walls and settles into the marrow of the 36 women huddled against the coal chute. But the most profound absence is the smell of life. The air is thick with the biological reality of confinement, the sour reek of unwashed wool, the metallic tang of dried blood from unhealed sores, and the acrid, ammonia-heavy scent of fear sweat that has turned stale over weeks of waiting. These are the Wehrmachthelferinnen, female auxiliaries of the German machine, now reduced to shivering organic matter wrapped in torn Wehrmacht greatcoats. They do not speak. The silence is heavy, vibrating with the suppressed, shallow breathing of women who have learned that noise attracts death. Then the beam cuts through the gloom. It is blindingly white, a flashlight beam that dances over the dust motes suspended in the freezing air like frozen time. It catches the edge of a steel helmet, then a face, unshaven, jaw set, eyes shadowed under a rim. An American. The women flinch. A collective, involuntary, somatic recoil. Muscles lock. Breath stops. They brace for the shout, the kick, the violence promised by months of Goebbels' propaganda. But the soldier does not fire. He steps forward, and the sound is wrong. It is the creak of high-quality leather and the soft thud of rubber soles, not the terrifying metallic clatter of hobnailed jackboots. He kneels. And then the smell hits them. It is a sensory assault, dizzyingly alien and clean. The sharp medicinal scent of Lifebuoy soap, the sweet, cured aroma of Virginia tobacco, and the faint chemical tang of peppermint gum. He reaches out. Not for a Luger, but toward the woman slumped against the damp brickwork, her legs swollen to twice their size with starvation edema. He slides his arms under her knees and back. The daughter, a girl of 12, watching from the shadows, feels her stomach drop, a physical blow of confusion that hits harder than hunger. Why are you carrying my mother? The question hangs unasked in the cold air, dismantling the entire architecture of her world. The enemy is not killing. The enemy is lifting the weight she can no longer bear. Background: the logistical landscape. To understand the visceral shock of that cellar moment, one must first navigate the logistical ruin that preceded it. By the spring of 1945, the German Reich was not merely losing a war, it was undergoing a total biological and material collapse. The sophisticated supply lines that had once fed the Wehrmacht had disintegrated into a chaotic scramble for survival. For the women of the Wehrmachthelferinnen, the transition from military personnel to captive was marked by an immediate and catastrophic drop in caloric intake and a descent into environmental exposure. The captivity experience for German prisoners in American hands was bifurcated into two distinct sensory worlds: the Golden Cage and the Mud Hell. The Golden Cage referred to the established POW camps, often in the United States or fully developed bases in the UK and France. Here, the shock of the mundane was defined by abundance. Prisoners in these camps experienced a material culture shock that bordered on the hallucinogenic. They slept in heated barracks with waterproof roofs. They were issued bars of soap that lathered, unlike the gritty German ersatz clay soap. They ate white bread. For a German woman captured and sent to a facility like this, the experience was defined by the sudden return of color and taste to a gray world. However, the vast majority of captives in 1945, including many Wehrmachthelferinnen, caught in the final dragnet, found themselves in the mud hell of the Rhine Meadow Camps. These were not camps in the traditional sense. They were open-air enclosures on the floodplains of the Rhine River. There were no buildings. There were no tents. There were no latrines. The sensory reality of the Rheinwiesenlager was of wet earth and exposure. With no shelter, prisoners were forced to dig foxholes into the mud with their bare hands or discarded tin cans to escape the biting wind. When it rained, these holes filled with water, forcing the occupants to stand in the mud for days on end. The Wehrmachthelferinnen in these camps were stripped of their status and often their gender protections. Huddled in masses of gray humanity, the ground itself became the enemy, a sucking mire that swallowed boots and warmth. The lack of sanitation meant that within days the camps smelled of dysentery and rot, a landscape of biological breakdown. The suffering in the Rhine-Wiesenlager was not purely accidental. It was exacerbated by a calculated legal maneuver that stripped the prisoners of their rights. In March 1945, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower issued an order creating a new classification for German captives, Disarmed Enemy Forces, DEF. This bureaucratic distinction had profound somatic consequences. By classifying the millions of surrendering troops and auxiliaries as DEF rather than POWs, the U.S. Army circumvented the Geneva Convention's requirements for rations and housing. Under the convention, POWs were required to be fed the same rations as their captors. In 1945, the U.S. ration was approximately 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, a logistical impossibility for millions of prisoners in a shattered Europe. As DEFs, the prisoners were entitled only to what was available, which often meant starvation rations. The statistics of this disparity were physically brutal. While a U.S. soldier, the victor, received around 4,000 calories a day and slept in barracks or billets, a German POW protected by the Geneva Convention in the UK or US received a sustaining 2,000 to 2,500 calories a day and heated shelter. In stark contrast, the German DEFs in the Rhine Meadows received only 700 to 1,000 calories a day while living in open fields. Even the civilian population in the U.S. zone was subsisting on a mere 1,000 to 1,250 calories, living in rubble and cellars. The Wehrmachthelferinnen found themselves in a legal gray zone. They were uniformed personnel, yet not soldiers. Captives, yet not POWs. This status meant they were at the bottom of the logistical food chain. They were a surplus population in a land that could no longer feed its own people. The backdrop to this captivity was the hunger winter of 1946 to 1947, a climatic anomaly that froze the waterways of Europe and halted the transport of coal and food. This was the coldest winter in living memory, turning the occupation zones into landscapes of cryonic suspension. In the American zone, the official ration for the German population dropped to between 1,000 to 1,250 calories per day. This is a starvation diet, insufficient to maintain basal metabolic rates in active adults. However, the reality was often far grimmer. The breakdown of the German transport system meant that even these meager rations often existed only on paper. The diet consisted almost exclusively of carbohydrates, watery soup, and Kommissbrot. The bread was a dense, dark brick, often extended with sawdust, potato peelings, or ground tree bark to increase its volume. It was heavy in the hand, but vanished in the stomach, leaving a gnawing, acidic emptiness. The physical sensation of this hunger was not a sharp pang, but a dull, consuming lethargy. The body deprived of fuel began to cannibalize itself. Women reported the cessation of menstruation, amenorrhea, not as a medical symptom, but a somatic marker of their dehumanization, the body shutting down non-essential functions to preserve the heart and brain. The cold was pervasive. Without body fat, the freezing temperatures bit directly into the bone. The lack of coal meant that heating was impossible. The only warmth came from the huddled mass of other bodies. In this environment, the sensory experience of the world narrowed to the immediate demands of the body. The pain of frostbitten toes, the gnawing ache of an empty stomach, and the desperate, animalistic drive to secure the next calorie. The arrival of the Americans, with their smell of tobacco and gasoline, represented not just a political change, but a biological one. If hunger was the constant background noise of captivity, hygiene was the acute flashpoint of shame. For the Wehrmachthelferinnen, many of whom came from the disciplined, fastidious culture of the BDM, the League of German Girls, the loss of sanitary supplies was a direct assault on their identity. The collapse of the German economy meant that manufactured sanitary napkins were non-existent. In the camps, women were forced to improvise with rags, scraps of cloth torn from uniforms, moss gathered from the fields, or layers of newspaper scavenged from the trash. These improvised solutions were physically abrasive and wholly inadequate. The lack of water for washing meant that these rags could rarely be cleaned, leading to constant chafing, infection, and the pervasive metallic smell of old blood that became the olfactory signature of the women's barracks. The shame of leaking in a public, mixed-gender environment was a constant psychological torture. The lice infestation, or Kleiderlois, added a layer of relentless somatic torture. The parasites thrived in the seams of the unwashed wool uniforms. Their bites caused an incessant burning itch that made sleep impossible. The scratching led to open sores, which, in the filth of the camps, quickly became infected with impetigo or typhus. The American response to this biological threat was the liberal application of DDT. This process was experienced by the women not as medical care, but as an industrial processing. They were lined up, often marched through stations where soldiers pumped the white powder down their collars, up their sleeves, and into their hair using pneumatic dusters. The sensation was choking. The powder coated the skin in a chalky chemical layer that dried out the eyes and throat. It smelled of chemicals and dust, a scent that would forever trigger memories of humiliation. The ultimate somatic violation was the shorn head. While historically associated with the tendu of France, women punished by mobs for horizontal collaboration, the shaving of heads in the camps served a dual purpose: medical delousing and psychological subjugation. For a German woman of the 1940s, long hair was a primary signifier of femininity and dignity. To have it buzzed off by an indifferent captor was to be neutered. The sensory experience, the buzz of the clippers, the cold air hitting the exposed scalp, and the sight of one's own hair piling up on the muddy floor was a trauma that lingered long after the hair grew back. In some camps, a stripe was shaved down the center of the head, a mark known as the Surenstrasse, or a lice path, marking them physically as prisoners. This rendered them visible and vulnerable, stripping away the last vestige of their pre-war individuality. The interaction with American material culture produced a sensory disorientation that bordered on the hallucinogenic. The American soldier was a walking repository of items that, to the German prisoner, seemed like artifacts from a future civilization. The most potent symbol of this abundance was white bread. To a German populace raised on dense, sour rye bread, and lately on the sawdust-filled Kummisbrot, the American white bread was unrecognizable. It was soft, blindingly white, and tasted of sugar. Many prisoners initially mistook it for cake. The texture was startlingly sponge-like, dissolving in the mouth without the need for chewing. Eating it produced a rapid spike in blood sugar, a physiological rush that was almost intoxicating to a starving body. This white bread shock was a gustatory realization of defeat. The Kummisbrot represented the hard, gritty endurance of the Reich. The white bread represented the soft, overwhelming abundance of the democracy. To eat it was to physically ingest the reality of the American victory. This shock was paralleled by the introduction of nylon stockings. In a Europe where women had resorted to painting seams on their bare legs with gravy browning or eye pencil to simulate stockings, the sheer, smooth tactility of nylon was a revelation. It was a material that spoke of a world untouched by the grime of war. When American soldiers traded nylons for laundry services or other favors, they were trading not just a luxury item, but a piece of modernity. The touch of the fabric against rough, chapped skin highlighted the disparity between the victor's abundance and the vanquish's squalor. In the resource-starved camps, survival depended on ingenuity. The bucket trick, or the immersion heater hack, was a prime example of POW adaptation. It involved a dangerous improvisation, taking two steel razor blades, attaching them to wires, and separating them with a non-conductive spacer, often wood, a button, or a matchstick. The device was then immersed in a mug or bucket of water. When plugged into a live socket, often spliced from a light fixture, the current arced through the water, especially if a pinch of salt was added to increase conductivity, boiling it in seconds. The device hissed and popped, a terrifying little engine of survival. It allowed women to sterilize water, make ersatz coffee, or heat a rare tin of food. It was a mastery of physics born of desperation, a small reclamation of power over their freezing environment. The relationship between the Wehrmachthelferinnen and the GIs was governed by the official non-fraternization policy, but biology and logistics frequently overruled policy. The tension was palpable in the olfactory landscape. American soldiers smelled distinctively different from German men. They smelled of Lifebuoy soap, a carbolic medicinal scent that was sharp and clean. They smelled of Virginia tobacco, which was sweeter and more aromatic than the harsh Turkish blends or ersatz weeds smoked by the Germans. They smelled of peppermint gum and antiseptic. For the German women, this scent of the victor was confusing. It was the scent of the enemy who had bombed their cities, yet it was also the smell of safety, warmth, and cleanliness. The fraternization paradox lay in this sensory confusion. A GI offering a bar of soap or a stick of gum was, technically, a conqueror imposing his will, yet the somatic reality of the gift, the taste of sugar, the lather of soap, felt like kindness. This dynamic birthed the phenomenon of the chocolate girls, women who engaged in relationships for access to material goods. But it also led to moments of genuine, non-sexual human friction. The image of a soldier handing a weeping woman a piece of white bread wasn't just a transaction, it was a collision of two material worlds. The woman, expecting a blow, received instead a calorie bomb wrapped in wax paper. Turning point, the human friction. The climax of the somatic experience often occurred in the medical tents. Here, the body was laid bare, quite literally, to the conqueror. For many Wehrmachthelferinnen, the mandatory medical inspections for venereal disease were moments of acute terror and shame. Lined up, stripped naked, and subjected to public examination, they felt the full weight of their powerlessness. The fear was compounded by Nazi propaganda that had painted the Americans as gangsters and rapists. In one documented narrative, a woman recoils violently when the American doctor attempts to examine her. "It burns when you touch it," she whispers, shielding her side. The doctor, expecting a hidden weapon or contraband, instead finds a festering, untreated wound, shrapnel or a chemical burn from the phosphorus raids, concealed under layers of filthy rags. She had hidden it for weeks, fearing that defectives would be executed, a holdover from Nazi eugenic indoctrination. The turning point is not the discovery of the wound, but the doctor's reaction. He does not recoil in disgust. He does not shout. He reaches for a jar of sulfa powder or a bandage. The sensory details of this moment are crucial. The cool touch of the metal instruments, the stinging bite of the antiseptic, and the sudden, overwhelming relief of pain being acknowledged. For the prisoner, this is the moment the American monster of propaganda dissolves into a human being with healing hands. The burn of the medicine becomes a somatic bridge between enemy and patient. The narrative arc of Why Are You Carrying My Mother finds its historical anchor in humanitarian interventions like Operation Stork. This was a British operation to evacuate children from Berlin to the countryside to avoid starvation. Similar ad hoc evacuations and moments of assistance occurred in the American zones. The scene described in the memoirs involves the physical lifting of the weak, a reversal of the survival of the fittest doctrine the women had lived under for 12 years. In the cellar or the train station, the German mother is incapacitated by typhus or starvation edema. Her body is a dead weight, a sack of bones that she can no longer drag. The daughter, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, stands guard, fiercely protective but physically helpless. When the American soldier approaches, the somatic expectation is violence. Instead, he performs an act of physical service. He lifts the mother. The sensory detail here is the contrast in mass. The soldier is bulked up by high-calorie rations, his uniform thick and high quality. The mother is light, hollowed out by hunger. The daughter watches the transfer of weight. She sees the soldier's hands, clean, perhaps gloved in leather, grasping the dirty wool of her mother's coat. She smells the leather of his gear and the faint scent of motor oil. This moment disrupts the binary of war. The enemy is carrying her burden. The question, "Why are you carrying my mother?" is the pivot point where the war officially ends for the child, not with a treaty, but with the physical sensation of being helped. This theme of somatic kindness reached its zenith with Operation Little Victuals, orchestrated by U.S. pilot Gail Halvorson. While flying the Berlin airlift, Halvorson began dropping candy to children waiting at the Tempelhof fences. The mechanics of this were somatic poetry. He tied chocolate bars and gum to tiny parachutes made from handkerchiefs. For the German children, the experience was multisensory. First, the sound, the roar of the C-54 engines and the specific wiggle of the wings that signaled Halvorson's plane. Then, the sight of the white parachutes drifting down against the gray Berlin sky. Finally, the taste. Chocolate was a rarity. For many children, it was a flavor they had never experienced or had forgotten. The taste of American chocolate, sweeter and milkier than the dark, bitter German variety, was the taste of hope. It was a calorie-dense promise that the West would not let them starve. Halvorson's operation dropped over 23 tons of candy, a logistical feat that won the hearts of Berlin more effectively than any propaganda poster. The somatic legacy. The legacy of the Wehrmachthelferinnen experience was written on the body. For years after their release, many women suffered from the long-term effects of the hunger winter. Amenorrhea often persisted long after food became available, a lasting reminder of the time their bodies shut down. Infertility was a common silent scar, a somatic echo of the starvation that had ravaged their reproductive systems. The shorn head grew back, but the phantom sensation of the clippers remained. Women would instinctively reach up to cover their hair when startled. The shame of the lice, the degradation of the open latrines, and the public nakedness of the medical inspections settled into a deep, internalized somatic shame. They carried these memories in their posture, a permanent flinch, a tendency to hoard food, and a compulsion towards aggressive cleanliness. The physical record of these years revealed a spectrum of long-term somatic impacts. Starvation diets of less than 1,000 calories a day led to lasting reproductive issues like amenorrhea and infertility. The constant exposure to cold and parasites resulted in dermatological scars and a lifelong sensitivity to cold. Psychologically, the era of food insecurity manifested in food hoarding and phantom hunger. Even specific smells, like the chemical scent of DDT, would trigger visceral memories of the delousing stations. Yet there was also a legacy of kindness. The taste of Hershey's chocolate, the smell of Lifebuoy soap, and the texture of nylon became sensory anchors for a generation. These items, once symbols of the enemy, became totems of survival. The golden cage of the American camps, compared to the horrors of the Russian front or the starvation in the cities, was remembered with a complex mixture of guilt and gratitude. The carrying moment, the soldier lifting the mother, became a family myth, passed down not as a story of defeat, but as a story of humanity. The daughter, now grown, would remember the smell of that soldier: tobacco, peppermint, and soap. That olfactory memory would forever be associated with safety. The history of the body told a different story than the history books. The maps showed a conquered nation. The bodies remembered the warmth of a wool blanket and the taste of white bread. 6. Reflection/closure. The intimate archive. History is often recorded in the movement of armies, the shifting of borders, and the signing of treaties. But the true history of 1945 to 1948 lies in the Alltagsgeschichte, the history of everyday life. It is found in the itch of a louse bite, the dangerous hiss of a razor blade heater in a mug of water, and the shock of white bread on a starving tongue. These somatic experiences, the hunger, the cold, the touch, transcended the political designations of Axis and Ally. In the intimate space of the cellar or the clinic, the grand narratives of fascism and democracy collapsed into the immediate reality of two human bodies interacting. The soldier carrying the mother did not carry a Nazi, he carried a weight. The doctor treating the burn did not treat an enemy, he treated flesh. The legacy of this era is not just the Marshall Plan or the division of Berlin. It is the molecular memory of a generation that learned that survival often tasted like American sugar, and that sometimes the hand that holds the weapon is also the hand that lifts you up. The sensory archive of the Wehrmachthelferinnen remains a testament to the vulnerability of the human body and the enduring power of small, physical acts of grace in a world shattered by war.